Hello and welcome to the Slackware ARM podcast. My name is Brenton Earl. I'm a Slackware contributor and today I'm going to run through a installation guide for the HoneyComb LX2K. The very first step is to configure the dip switch so that you can boot from an SD card. Here's a layout of the HoneyComb and you'll find the dip switch, which they referred to as the boot source selector, right next to the processor. Close up, this is what it looks like. And here's what you'll set it to if you're going to boot from the SD card. As you can see, you can also boot from the eMMC and SPI flash. The next step is to download the firmware that you're going to write to your SD card. You can find that at images.solid-run.com. Then you'll go to the LX2K directory and we're going to go to the UEFI directory. And my HoneyComb is using memory that is at 3200 clock speed, and so this is what I would download. To be safe, you can probably download this one if you don't know what your RAM clock speed is, but I really recommend you get the correct speed of it. It will improve performance. I've already downloaded it to this directory, and you can see that I have an SD card already connected, and we're going to write that right now. Once that is done, it's time to write the installer to your thumb drive. The installer is not currently posted, but this is the directory. This is where you'll find it, slackware.uk. As you can see, we have the Raspberry Pi, the RK3399 chipset, which is the Pinebook Pro, and the Rock Pro. So I've already prepared the installer for myself, and I'm going to write it to my USB stick here. It's going to take a while, but you can see it's SDD. So this is going to take a while, so I will pause the video and I'll be right back. So now that we have the installer on the thumb drive and the firmware on the SD card, it's time to plug in your serial cable to the micro USB port of the HoneyComb and the USB male connection into a second computer. And once that's done, you can go back to your second computer and launch Screen, which will give you access to the serial console. This is the command you need to type: connect. It's fairly common with the Slackware installation to require this on the Rock Pro and various other boards. Even prior to the 64-bit port, it was the case for Slackware ARM. So I've already connected, so I'm going to reconnect to the screen session I've created and show you the BIOS, the firmware interface. And so we are on step 7. We've turned it on. There's a point where you hit escape to launch the firmware. And now I'm going to show you a little bit about the firmware so you know how to use it while you're installing your HoneyComb. So we have in the boot manager, these are all drives, these are Pixie boots. This is to launch off the SD card, which we can't do because the SD card has the firmware. And this is to launch off the eMMC. You can see up here Same here. And this is another hard drive that is a data drive. And this is my current installation, but I'm going to boot directly off the USB stick so that it launches the installer without any other drives being active. And so now we have a common interface called of Grub, where we can either boot using an HDMI cable, which will be the first entry, if you've got a video card. But in this guide, we're going to just launch with the serial console, and we're going to wait for the installer to load. Takes a minute to load off the SD card. Couple of fatal module loads. Okay, so it's bringing up the network, and there we go. So because I have the Slackware tree already downloaded to one of the internal drives, I'm going to mount that first. So you can see on my RAID configuration I have the repo there, right here. Now I'm going to partition the drive. The one we're going to be modifying, which is my root disk, is that SDD. And we're going to overwrite it with the GPT partition so that we can store an EFI partition. Anywhere but between 50 to 200 megabytes is plenty for the EFI partition. There we go. And we're going to make swap partition. And we're going to make the root partition. There we go. So you see, formatted it. It's ready to go for the installer. For now, we're going to ignore all these other drives. We're just going to launch the installer and later point it to the /repo directory where I have my files stored. Add the swap. And now this is the root disk and the partition I want. We'll just stick with ext4. And it should pick up the EFI partition and format it. And we're going to skip the other drives. The installer doesn't need to know about them. I'm going to add them post installation. Okay. I leave FS checks on. Okay, so it found the EFI partition and we are going to install from a pre-mounted directory. And we have our package sets. For the video purposes, I'm going to do a partial install, also because serves as a server for me, not a desktop, so that'll save me some time later. Maybe we'll add D. Okay, and we're off. I'll come back a little bit later after the installer has progressed a little bit further. So we've installed all the packages, and now the Grub bootloader has been installed, and we are synchronizing the RAM disk so that it can boot a generic kernel. Okay, so now we're going to configure the mouse and disable the graphical mouse in a terminal, and I can configure the network. We'll call it HoneyComb. And we're going to assign the address by DHCP. My router has a reservation for my IP address on this machine, so this is easier to set it up. And I have to enable a few services. Okay. I'm in the Mountain Time Zone, and okay, setting the root password. Okay, so the installation is complete, and we have no other steps to complete until we reboot, and we will configure the boot manager within the firmware to have an entry for the HoneyComb, and then we're going to reorder it and bump it up to the top of the list. So what I like to do at the end of every install is add a user, and within the chroot. Configure the groups, and add them to the wheel group. Set the password, and then exit. And in this guide we say to power off completely after you've installed it, due to a bug in the firmware. When you reboot from the installer, can't read settings for the firmware, can't probe the hardware for some reason. But shutting it down completely and then restarting it fixes that usually. Okay, so you press escape to get to this menu before it times out. Uh, Go to boot maintenance, change the boot order. Let's see what it has in the list. Actually, I think the list is okay. It's going to boot off the uh, first drive, the 100 gigabyte, 120 gigabyte that we used to install, mounted as a root disk. So we don't actually need to change anything here. Just go to continue, and there we go. You see, found the root FS, and it's taking the boot files off the root partition because the Slackware ARM installer uses labels instead of UIDs. Now, if you want to boot from uh, Grub and you have an HDMI cable plugged in for your monitor and a keyboard, you would use the first option. But since my system, I have currently nothing plugged into the GPU, so I'm using the serial console to boot the system for the first time. And once it's up, I'll connect over a secure shell to make the screen a little bit bigger. I think it's probing, and I still have the USB. Yeah, the USB stick is still in, and it's trying to probe it. Okay. Alright, it's booting into the system. For some reason, when I leave this thumb drive plugged in on a fresh install, I can't find it in the USB hub for the case. And there we go. It's installed. So at the bottom here in this of the list, I have a link to the installer documentation, which I'm still currently working on. But the thing I think most people will be interested in at this point is what hardware I added to my build besides the board itself. Um, and so you can find that by going to that URL. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can find me on Linux Questions, or you can email me directly in the email just listed below. Alright,